Keir Giles is a Russia analyst at the think tank Chatham House and joins us from Northamptonshire in the UK. Keir, good to have you on the News Hour. So how much influence does the Collective Security Treaty Organization really have, especially given Russia's actions in Ukraine right now?
Well, the key point is what your correspondent mentioned there right at the end, that this is not a genuine collective security treaty organization. Instead, it's a means for exerting Russian control. And of course, now that Russia is weak, that control is weak too. The CSTO was set up to mimic NATO and to provide a kind of counterpart to NATO so that Russia could pretend to some legitimacy in exerting its control over its neighbors. In fact, it has an article in its founding treaty, which is very similar to NATO's Article 5, which in theory says that everybody has to respond to an external attack on one of the members. But that's been shown to be completely hollow by the war between the fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan that your correspondent mentioned. So the danger is that a lot of people will realize that not only the CSTO is a hollow organization which does not actually fulfill its functions, but it might also be tempting for other regional states to actually start settling their scores with their neighbors because that blanket of control from Moscow has now been lifted.
Well, that's what I wanted to touch on. You speak about Moscow being weak. Who would take advantage of this seeming weakness by Russia?
We've also seen noises from Georgia about revisiting the result of the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, which ended up with Russia occupying almost 20% of Georgian territory. That has been a long-running sore, like many of the other regional conflicts around Russia's periphery that flared up after the end of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, when that regional control that Moscow had exerted previously was also weak. So the fear is that just like 30 years ago, because there isn't that restraining factor, all of these countries that have these long-running, insoluble arguments with their neighbors might seek to resort to force to resolve them.
And of course, nobody wants to see any of those really escalate because they've got huge geopolitical consequences. But some of these former Soviet states, like Belarus, for example, have really remained fiercely loyal to Russia, especially in the wake of the war. But then we see Kazakhstan staying fairly neutral. Why do you think that is?
What I think the war has actually accentuated is these forces which are pulling all of these former Soviet countries even further away from Russia. Now, there are different countries in the region that have gone further or less far down that track of moving away from the old Soviet dependencies, and Kazakhstan is taking the opportunity to assert itself as an independent country and remind Russia that actually, no, it is no longer dependent on Moscow. Belarus is a special case, of course. It is Moscow's only ally, and in fact, notionally, a union state exists between Russia and Belarus. And yet, Russia hasn't been able to get the Belarusian armed forces involved in its war on Ukraine. There's a suspicion that actually Belarus was supposed to be part of the plan for invading Ukraine, but Moscow couldn't actually persuade President Lukashenko and his army to join in. So everywhere you look, that control that Russia previously had appears to be weakening.
And so if these countries start to move away from Russia, who do they move towards, or if anyone at all?
Well, Russia's pretext for invading Ukraine was the notion that Ukraine was about to join NATO, and this in itself was going to be a threat to Russia. That's been exposed as completely baseless by Russia's subsequent statements, that it is just a genocidal war of reconquest for Russia's imperial ambition. Fortunately for the other countries in the region, Russia can't actually wage more than one of those at a time, it seems. And so those other countries are actually more free to choose their own path. Now, again, thinking of the example of Belarus, they refer to that as a multi-vector foreign policy. In other words, we're not just going to be dependent on Moscow. We're going to look to other world centers of power to build our relationships. So we should look to those countries in Central Asia, for example, trying to do the same thing, trying to emphasize their independence and their ability to make their own foreign and security policy choices for the futures of their own people.
Very much a changing region indeed, especially in the wake of this war in Ukraine. Keir Giles, Russia analyst, live to us there from Northamptonshire in the UK. Keir, great to have you on the program. Thank you so much.